The new Silicon Macs look really good, but for me, the lack of bootcamp support is a bit of a problem. I've always used Macs for software like Final Cut Pro and Logic, but I need a Windows option as well for the VR support. It's nice to have macOS and Windows running on the same machine, but this might not be so possible in the future. Even if a decent Windows emulation comes to the Silicon Macs, it's unlikely that Oculus will support the integrated graphics anytime soon. Steam has dropped macOS support, so the best hope for Apple VR is probably with a future headset that they make themselves. For me, working with 360 content and VR, it's either an Intel Mac or a Silicon Mac plus an additional PC. To get an idea of my options going forward, I thought I'd do a video on high-resolution 360 video editing on a few Apple computers. I'll be testing and comparing three machines: the 2020 iMac, upgraded with Radeon Pro 5700 XT graphics, the 2017 27-inch iMac with Radeon 580 graphics, and a new M1 Macbook Pro. I borrowed the M1 Mac for an afternoon, so these tests might be a bit rough and ready. I'll try and do this more accurately when I get more time. I'll run tests based on a typical workflow for creating 8K 360 content from stitching to encoding. The first stage after shooting is to get the footage onto the computer and ready for stitching. I'll be using one of the most popular professional 360 cameras, the Insta360 Pro 2. I'll be taking a 30-second clip shot in 8K monoscopic at 60 frames a second and running it through a typical 360 workflow. For stitching, I'll be using the Insta360 Stitcher software. I was going to test Mistika VR, but transferring the licenses between computers is a bit fiddly. Maybe I'll leave that for another video. For editing and encoding, I'll be using Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere Pro. I use Final Cut Pro mainly, though Premiere has some advantages for me, like the ambisonic audio and the fact that you can also load it up on Windows via Boot Camp and play the timeline back directly to a headset. Final Cut Pro is optimized for the M1 Macbook Pro, though all of the other software I'll be running on it will be through the Rosetta emulation layer. Still, if it's as good as everyone says it is, it should still perform pretty well. I'll record a 30-second clip in 8K monoscopic at 60 frames a second and transfer the clip to the computer via Ethernet, which brings the 7 SD cards of the Pro 2 into one folder that can be stitched. I've loaded the folder onto each machine running the Insta360 Stitcher software. The software can stitch in H.264, H.265 or ProRes. I'll choose H.264 for now. The 2020 iMac finishes in 4 minutes 45 seconds, while the 2017 iMac is at 60% complete, and the M1 MacBook Pro is still at 53%. The 2017 iMac eventually finishes after 8 minutes 17 seconds, a bit more than half the speed of the 2020 iMac. The MacBook Pro finishes after 10 minutes 26 seconds, a bit under half the speed of the 2020 iMac. Not bad considering it's a laptop and Insta360 Stitcher is not optimized for Apple Silicon. I asked both Insta360 and Mistika VR whether they've got plans to optimize for Apple Silicon yet. Both plan to do so at some point, but with no timeline on this. By way of comparison, I loaded up the same file on my old 2016 Windows laptop running a GTX 1070 graphics card. This is the machine I've been using up till now for stitching on the go. It stitched the file in about the same time as the MacBook Pro. I also tried to stitch on my 2017 MacBook Pro that I used for monitoring 360, among many other things, and it came in at a super slow 17 minutes. I'll now put the stitched file into Final Cut Pro and load it up on the timeline. If I'm doing a simple quick edit without much in the way of effects, I sometimes work with the H.264 files directly without transcoding to ProRes or making proxy files. When I play back the 8K 60 frames a second files from the timeline, the 2020 iMac and the M1 Mac play back with dropped frames, though still usable. The 2017 iMac really struggles with this. For comparison, I loaded up an 8K monoscopic file at 30 frames a second, filmed on the Insta360 Pro 1 camera. The 2020 iMac and the M1 Macbook Pro playback this from the timeline perfectly, but the 2017 iMac still struggles with about a frame every second and a half. This is pretty impressive coming from the M1 Macbook Pro. I'll now encode a H.264 master file on each machine. The 2020 iMac finishes at 9 minutes 30, while the 2017 iMac is still at 50%, while the M1 Mac is still way back at 16%. The M1 did catch up though, and eventually came in second at 2/3 the speed of the 2020 iMac. Next, I transcoded the clip to ProRes 422 for better performance on the timeline. The 2020 iMac transcoded to ProRes in 1 minute 28 seconds. The 2017 iMac and the M1 MacBook Pro both finished around the same time in 3 minutes 30, less than half the speed of the 2020 iMac. All machines played back the footage perfectly when transcoded to ProRes. Next, I loaded up the file with a few common effects for 360, a nadir patch, a simple mask and some radical color correction. I tried using the 360 noise reduction plugin, but this would only work with the 2020 iMac. The other two wouldn't even let me load it due to hardware limitations. As the 2020 iMac hits 50%, the 2017 iMac is not doing bad at 33%, but the M1 MacBook Pro is way behind at 3%. The plugins I'm using on this test are all standard ones with Final Cut Pro, so presumably optimized, though this appears to really slow the M1 Mac down. I didn't have time to finish this test, so the M1 may well have caught up and performed better in the end, like in the previous encoding test. The last test I'll do is with Adobe Premiere, encoding the same 8K 60 frames a second clip to H.264. The 2020 iMac hits 50% pretty quickly, while a 2017 iMac is less than half the speed at 20%. The M1 MacBook Pro, meanwhile, is half that again at 9%. The 2020 iMac finishes at 2 minutes 30. I made no attempt to ensure that the settings were the same as in Final Cut Pro, so it's not meant to be a comparison. After a while, the M1 MacBook Pro catches up and finishes at 11 minutes 40, almost the same time as the 2017 iMac, though way behind the 2020 iMac, which finished at 2 minutes 30. So to conclude, the 2020 iMac is really fast. I've been using it for the past few months and it performs really well for regular video editing, as well as high resolution 360 post-production. Having the Windows Boot Camp option for running Oculus and Steam VR is also great. I'll do another video on the VR performance of the iMac later. Running Premiere on Windows and playing back directly to a headset is also useful, something that's only possible on macOS with the HTC Vive. Steam have dropped macOS support, though I've heard the Vive and the Vive Pro still work on Big Sur. The M1 MacBook plays back 8K footage from the timeline surprisingly well, and the encoding with Final Cut Pro, while a long way off the 2020 iMac, was still very good for a laptop. Performance in Premiere was not great, though it should get better when Adobe optimized for Apple Silicon. I only had a few hours with the M1 Mac, so these are rough and ready tests. For me, I'll be using the 2020 iMac for some time yet, but I'll be interested to see what the higher end Silicon Macs are like later this year. We'll be selling this 2017 iMac sometime soon, so if you're interested, give us a shout. Let me know in the comments what you think of all this and the Silicon Macs in general, and hit the subscribe and like button if you found this useful. Thank you.